terms of how well you're doing. Like, it's based on merit. But in China, they did regulate Western multinationals. I don't understand.
I mean, I would have to look at the specific literature, but are you aware of the specific provisions they had, and because I know China had certain, what would they be, economic free zones within the cities, but under what constraints did Western multinationals operate under? Do you know off the top of your head?
So, like I said, if you want to look into the specific policies, I cited you a book. There's a whole list, right? Mm-hmm. But in terms, yes, China has special economic zones. They're actually mostly outside of China, and this is something that China utilizes for development. It's not something I necessarily agree with, but in terms of Chinese businesses abroad, they have deals with these countries that basically allow for deregulation in certain zones where Chinese businesses are abroad. But this, China as a state heavily guided the arm of what corporations could do in China, heavily regulated their labor practices, heavily regulated everything that they did. And they actually started adding on more and more regulations as time went by, and they have continued to grow more and more, right? In terms of environmental regulations, China is pioneering in trying to basically route out a lot of environmental pollution and land grabs. And I don't agree with a lot of the things that China does, but as a development model, yes, they were heavily involved in regulating what businesses could or could not do, what sectors they could or could not work in, their labor practices, so on and so forth. And yet they were still able to utilize that foreign direct investment to open up with a state-guided sort of plan and develop successfully. But that is not neoliberal.
Well, I would have to read more into the literature of...
Wait, a quick point on the environmental regulations. You say that China pioneering in environmental regulations and sort of curbing these emissions, but just this year China added about 8.5 gigawatts of new coal power plants.
Okay, I'm talking about a lot of environmental runoff, specifically in central provinces, and land preservation, for example. I agree with you that most countries, actually all countries, are not doing enough in terms of curbing emissions. That's different than environmental regulations.
But they're not just not doing enough, they are actively doing the most.
Yes, I agree. It's not just China, it's the West, it's Europe, it's everybody, because under a capitalist economy, which China functions under, it's a state-regulated capitalist economy. Under a capitalist economy, mass production and mass consumption drives pretty much everything. And under a system like that, you cannot possibly curb emissions because you are incentivizing production, consumption, right? But in terms of international development, China's still doing a good job in relation to a lot of other countries that were in the global south, I would say, poor countries. What China has done has been better than a lot of other countries when it comes down to runoff and things like that, in conjunction with industrialization, incorporating that in their state model of development and still maintaining growth. But I agree, it's not enough. But that's not really what I'm debating.
Okay, fair enough.
Just to go back to the point you made on China having large regulation on the OEZs, this was the source I remember reading. I'll just read the whole thing. In addition, firms in OEZs enjoy a high level of autonomy in managing operations as they face minimal controls on goods movements and are allowed to export and import almost freely. Firms in OEZs also benefit from more flexible labor relations and more liberal land use. Additional benefits are available for export-oriented and advanced technology FEVs. From the reading I've done and whatever, I saw that the removal of regulations in OEZs, and that they were almost even beyond removing them, that the Chinese government would just overlook enforcing them because they knew that if they were too tight, that corporations would just leave, which is why I find your point on you pretty much attribute nothing to the to deregulation kind of sus. And I just feel like you're just trying to shift why the corporations came and why the growth happened to your concept on fucking corruption as being the main driver, and not the deregulation and just opening the markets to FDI in general, which I'm pretty sure it's just logical that that would play a larger role. But like I said before, if you don't have something which can measure the magnitude, it's almost like there's no point even discussing it, because I wouldn't be able to give like a fair rebuttal to that beyond like, okay, I trust you, but if there's no stats which suggest that it played a huge role in the magnitude,
Yeah, there's like most political economy on the topic of China concedes to the fact that it rejected Western concepts of like just institutions, but just because they had more flexible like allowances for international corporations does not mean that they had fully deregulated them at all. The state still played a huge role, right? You can have like a bilateral.
You would agree that
most bilateral investment treaties have some concessions, but that doesn't mean that it's like, for example, you could have, like in China, you work in the province you were born in, right? That is where you work. You get health insurance in that province. You do not get health insurance in other provinces, right? It's very difficult to migrate. So an example of like a more flexible labor practice, right, would be allowing somebody from a central province to work in a coastal province.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really see that in line with neoliberal deregulation, which basically lets like corporations do fuck all with your land, right? The state still plays a heavy fucking role in what the corporation can and cannot do.
I mean, sure, but that doesn't answer my main point. It's that in order to bring in growth, China removed labor regulations and gave corporations pretty much autonomy to act within the OEZs. Like, and that, I mean, that did play a big role. I don't see how you can deny that wasn't an important part of the growth.
But China didn't I don't understand. China's only put into place more strict labor regulations over time.
Yeah,
and
they loosened them they loosened them with the ascension of Deng, and now they're starting to become more strict with Jinping, especially in the last 5 years, and that has come at the cost of growth, and that has been acknowledged to play a part in the removal of FDI.
Hold on, China's only grown more and more, so how has that come at the expense of growth? Like, of course, after the fall
growth is like a factor, right? It's like obviously the GDP has increased, but the percentage it's increased by has gone down, and they've acknowledged that. I mean,
because of a recession.
It's even before COVID.
China was actually slated to be the richest country. Like, I'm really confused by what you're saying here, because yes, you had a former regime that sort of fell, and then you had Deng came into power and sort of restructured things. And as he restructured things, he had to rebuild things. So over time, originally he decided to utilize corruption in the bureaucracy to draw in foreign investment. This has been documented by Chinese political economists and Western political economists. They view it as sort of revolutionary in terms of international development. Instead of IMF-style shock therapy, you deregulate and then foreign direct investment comes in. No, instead you utilize corruption and nepotism, and you can use that actually as a tool. And then over time, that actually goes away as your country is able to incorporate that state-led development. I'm really confused as what you're saying with, like, your statement that China's growth has suffered because of more fair labor practice. Like, China actually has a very interesting method of direct democracy, for example, that allows for actually the public to participate, for example, in participatory budgeting. They can set the budget, right? People are heavily involved in the labor unions. There are state-led labor unions. So labor practices are incorporated. I think they've gotten better over time. They've needed to improve, but it's not like Deng axed labor and then as a tool to draw in corporations, right? It's that Deng built up labor, and Deng built up everything that he could build up, basically, and the subsequent regimes as well. But originally it was never neoliberal. Originally it was never just axing labor, axing all of these regulations like you're saying. The state signed bilateral investment treaties where corporations were aware that the state was going to have a heavy hand in what they were doing in China. And those bilateral investment treaties, as every single bilateral investment treaty is, both neoliberal and non-neoliberal, allowed some concessions to the corporations, but China did not embrace this sort of like free market, like draw in foreign direct investment sort of like strategy. That's never been a part of China's strategy. Never. And it's I don't know what source you're talking about.
I mean, I'll send you. I mean, you probably won't believe it because it was an IMF report, but it was just an overview of the FBI policy. I mean, like... It
was an IMF report.
I mean, I don't think that's really a fair... it's an IMF report, but I see no reason to see its bias. I think it's like...
Well, the IMF and the World Bank are gray research. They're not peer-reviewed. They're literature.
I mean, okay. Okay, but, like... Do you agree that China, in an effort to bring in growth, they did deregulate specific areas? And I guess we could look at the magnitude of what specific policies, but they did do that, and they did give autonomy to corporations, or they gave more autonomy. You agree with that, right?
They never gave full autonomy to corporations.
Maybe not like full autonomy, but they reduced the amount of... I'm not saying they gave them full autonomy. I'm saying they reduced the restrictions and regulations which they would normally have in those specific areas. Do you agree with that?
I think China did compared to Mao, China deregulated. Mm-hmm. But Deng, in comparison to like most other countries, was still highly authoritarian in his market practices. So I really wonder what you mean by deregulated. Because in that case, Cuba's deregulated right now because they allow restaurants to pop up, right?
Okay, well, I think there's an obvious difference between just letting free market enterprises exist and reduce the amount of and increasing the amount of autonomy they hold. And I mean, I think you're just I don't know if you're like willfully ignoring what I'm saying or just trying to like.
I'm confused by what you mean. Are you saying that corporations had autonomy in China and that was not Chinese autonomy, that was corporate autonomy in the zones that were being developed by corporations? Because I fully disagree. The state had full autonomy over those corporations throughout the entire guidance process.
Like were they able to influence their specific financial operations where it was the Chinese government in like the heads of fucking Google or like Apple telling them you can construct this and this, you can't import that? Like, what would you define as regulations? How were they enacted against them?
Yeah, I would say that the government of China was heavily involved in sort of the financial activity of any corporation that was...
Well, that runs contrary to what I just read from the IMF, which said that the exports and imports and the general financial activity were left unrestricted. So, do you have a source for that? Like,
I cited you a book.
Do you have I can't read the whole book. Do you have an excerpt from that? Because I'll send you what I just read.
I told you I will. The moment I get home, I can send you the entire excerpt. I can fucking send you a whole chapter, okay?
Okay, well...
The IMF was talking about... First off, I'm really interested why you think that importing and exporting things without a barrier when it's been sort of agreed upon, right? So a fair trade deal and a free trade deal are different, right? One of them is actually, I guess technically neither of them have a quote-unquote restriction, but they do, because one of them is an exception to the rule, and one of them's the rule.
I'm not arguing whether they were good or not. I'm arguing that was the policy of China.
Having a bilateral investment treaty that allows for free flow imports and exports of one specific like corporate entity's like commodity, right, is not simply like that doesn't mean that the government's not involved in the financial activities of that corporation. Auditing it fully, requiring like public transparency, which the IMF does not do with these corporations. That's actually why we see a lot of human rights violations from them. That doesn't mean that China isn't directing exactly what they can export. It doesn't mean that China isn't directing exactly how their labor practices have to be run. It doesn't mean that China isn't overseeing exactly where they have to operate, what environmental like initiatives they're allowed to do. That does like we are fully like not on the same page of what it means to be deregulating, because I do see some instances where you have an agreement to export and import without a tariff to still be under the directive of the Chinese state, because the Chinese state is still heavily involved in the process.
It's not the tariff that matters. It's that they are able to perform these operations without requiring government approval or whatever. Like the specific line from this report that I will read is that, in addition, firms and OEZs enjoy a high level of autonomy in managing operations, as they face minimal controls on goods movements and are allowed to export and import almost freely. Firms and OEZs also benefit from more flexible labor relations and more liberal land use. Is that not deregulation to you? I mean, the government, what it's saying is the government has fucking zero control or zero say.
That's not what it's
Maybe
saying.
not zero say, but they are just letting them be. They are not, the government is not directly interfering in their financial operations.
No.
For the most part, the corporations are able to do internally what they believe to be right. As long as it's not like fucking shooting some Chinese people.
That is not what that said. You are
that
completely misrepresenting it. You were saying that means free flow of goods when you have a bilateral investment treaty is not deregulation. It is a trade.
It's not just trade. It's just that these corporations are able to act on autonomy.
Yeah, more liberal labor practices. Okay, so in the bilateral investment treaty, they say you can have workers, like immigrants from central provinces, work in the coastal. But the government, guess what? Guess who's still setting those terms and conditions? The Chinese government. If you have quote-unquote more flexible labor laws, that does not mean you have any autonomy. Any concession made in that bilateral investment treaty was under the directive of the Chinese government.
The autonomy is not that they're able to freely abuse their workers. The autonomy is that they're able to do whatever, like financial operations.
But that's not true. That's not what you just read to me. That's not even what the IMF is saying. You're just misrepresenting it.
I don't think it's misrepresented. But you said before that the coastal cities are responsible for the majority of the growth, which they are. And these coastal cities, which tend to be where the OEZs are, also had flexible labor relations and gave more autonomy to corporations to perform their own operations, and they were responsible for the most growth. And then you brought up Chinese workers migrating from the interior out there. Like that, it makes no sense. Like you're not actually addressing what I'm saying. You're just kind of repeating the same lines that were said 20 times.
I'm telling you what quote unquote flexible labor laws can look like. Okay.
Well, I'm pretty sure in the context of this paper,
flexible labor laws.
In the context of this paper, labor regulations does not refer, or labor relations, sorry, does not refer to fucking Chinese workers coming from Xinjiang to Shanghai.
Do you have an example for me exactly of what they mean by more lax labor regulations?
I think you can use your brain. That what they're implying in the IMF report is that these corporations could operate in a way that might not be acceptable in other parts of China, and that the labor rights might not be as existent. It's not referring to Chinese workers coming in. I don't think a corporation cares where the workers come from. They care how they treat them, and the paper is obviously implying that they would treat them to a lesser degree that would be accepted by Chinese law because they operate within these zones. And hence why it was more business friendly and it brought in FDI.
I think you're just completely misunderstanding what the IMF is saying. Because what the IMF is saying is not inconsistent with what I've been saying, which is that bilateral investment treaties exist.
Do you understand? Sure. I agree. I agree.
Okay, let me finish speaking. Yeah.
Okay,
I don't think you understand how international business works, because you can have a highly regulatory business environment in which a bilateral investment treaty is signed where a government barters with a corporation but still has the final say over what allows the corporation to come in. In fact, Bolivia is currently doing that. They have a nationalized lithium reserve. MAS is currently bartering with corporations to see who can come in and mine lithium, right? But Bolivia is highly protectionist. It is practically socialist, right? It literally has a Marxist-Leninist party in power. So I agree with that. I don't think you understand what bilateral investment is. I don't think you understand what it means when they say, oh, okay, yeah, they have a deal. That doesn't mean anything other than the fact that it is under the government's directive and they may allow for more lax labor, like migration. You don't know.
Okay, you're just you're just making up these migrations.
What if the state union, for example, isn't allowed to function in the private sector? That may be something in China. I don't know the specifics of the union, right? But the bottom line is, you definitely don't. But you don't understand how bilateral investment treaties work, because this is not a surprise.
Can you explain? It's obvious that these companies, they want guarantees that their investment will be successful, so they barter with the Chinese in exchange for their investment, that we want these certain conditions. I understand that. Even if you don't want to call it neoliberalism, that's fine. But the government is bringing in investment under the guise that they'll operate in a looser labor environment and be subject to less controls. What do you want to call that then? maybe it's not neoliberalism because it's not enacted across the entire country, but you have these specific policies in these specific regions, which in turn bring in all the growth. You can call it whatever you want, but the truth is that those policies led to growth in these sectors, which in turn benefited the rest of China. If you don't want to call it neoliberalism, fine. Those are the facts. Like,
what the fact is in China is that the state found out that rich people and bureaucrats on the coasts had connections and then decided to utilize those connections, right? From a state-led plan, right? Heavily directed by the regime in power to develop certain sectors. And the government made bilateral investment deals basically with certain corporations and investors under the directive of the state with high levels of controls.
You say high levels of controls, but do you have a source for that? Like, do you have a source of the specific? Wait, okay. Yes. Well, you have a source, but you can't show it to me. I'm sorry. Then we can't have this debate.
Okay,
then.
You know what?
I can't directly read the direct words of what the source says or any summary of it.
If you're so interested in China, I really highly recommend actually reading a book about China.
Okay.
I mean, you came into this conversation saying you didn't know much about China and admitting it, which I respect.
I can make conclusions based on the papers that I've read and that point to specific factors.
Based off of an IMF report that does not in any way disagree with anything I've said. In fact, all it said basically is that, oh wow, China has deals with corporations that China has actually set up. And you decided that meant that they had axed labor protections for corporations, which is not true.
I didn't say they axed labor protections. I said it was lax.
More lax labor relations is not that is a very vague statement, which is in line with some of Deng's policies. I mean, I don't understand where you're drawing this conclusion that it was deregulation that drew investment into China. It's actually not true. At all.
You're just saying I'm sorry, but you're saying bullshit about that. Oh, this corruption and that these Chinese people apparently had massive connections to each and every industrial mogul in the U.S. as the main cause of growth.
Right.
Hey, I'm talking about the Western multinationals. Like, how did they? What? Okay, I'll ask you a very plain question. What do you think was the main factor in bringing over Western multinationals to China?
I think that there were several different factors, but I think mainly a lot of corporations recognized that China had a lot of potential in the fact that it was growing much faster than many of the other countries. Okay,
a lot of potential. And what changed between the administrations of Mao and Deng to allow this to happen?
Deng was willing to actually construct a plan that allowed for the private sector to function in China under the state's directive with high levels of regulation. That's the difference.
But then you say high levels of regulation.
Yeah.
What does that entail? Like, can you name any specific instance of the Chinese government during Deng time, heavily regulating the transactions or policies of these corporations?
So, for one, I believe under the Dengist policies, they have full access to the financial sort of comings and goings of whatever corporation is.
Okay, sure, they have the records, but did they ever use them to audit or use them to control them?
China is heavily aware of the financial activity that's occurring in China. It's actually something most countries should do because the private sector functions with a lot of impunity and very little transparency. So China actually mandates. Now, other way around, China's not very transparent, right? What audits China is China. That's fucking, come on, But the bottom line is that they are fully aware of all of the financial activity that is occurring in China. They have a state-mandated union. They have participatory budgeting. There's authority, they have, now policies change from province to province, right? Still under a state directive plan. It's a decentralized authoritarian state, right? So the state still has a directive, but sort of local areas can pilot out different policies. I believe in China, over 60% of their enterprises are state-owned. So the private, it may have changed, but the private sector was, or is, I still believe it's that way, is a minority in the country. The state chooses where in the country it can work, chooses what environmental context it can work in, chooses what they can export and what they can import, and chooses what sector they can work in. They have a say over everything. The state direct the private sector.
Wait, can I just add button for a second? Are you discussing like multinationals? Are you just discussing the domestic Chinese private industries? Because I was always referring to the role multinationals played, not just.
I'm talking about multinationals because China, because a lot of people in China were actually opposed to the private sector in general. Deng actually decided it would be easier to draw in foreign direct investment in foreign multinationals because they were already capitalist. I don't disagree that China is a capitalist country. I think that China is a state-run capitalist country, right? But they actually drew in foreign multinationals because foreign multinationals were already they were already functionally capitalist. So you could sort of like overcome the fact that people domestically had an aversion to capitalism, right? By using international investment.
Can you use Jack Ma as an example of why it's not a capitalist country?
What?
Jack? Is it Jack? What's the Ma guy? What's the Alibaba guy? Jack, right? Jam. Come on, what's his name? Jack Ma.
Jack Ma.
It's Jack Ma.
Yeah, so this is a guy that's a billionaire, and he's a capitalist. But what happens when he steps out of line and says some things that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like? He gets his fucking dick handed to him. No, sorry for the language, but that shows what takes priority there, right? Am I right, fellas? Everyone, ladies? Shows you a little bit. That's a pretty good example there with great dismay. Nay, yay? What do you think?
So yes, I would say that the state has directive over the private sector. Yes.
Word. That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Thank you for putting that into words that like sound good and stuff.
That's what I was saying. Thank
Word.
you.
Yeah, word.
Is anyone going to say anything?
They are they say, you know what though? I don't know what to really think when you see, I know that happened for sure, right? But when you hear about surveillance state, yeah, that's pretty true too. But can you really believe the shit you hear? And what are your sources for everything? I'm just saying in general, right? Like it's really fucking hard to get an idea. Is this an 18 plus room? Can I cuss?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, is it cool? You guys don't have kids around. Okay, it's difficult to discern what's the reality anywhere outside of your own bubble, because sources are there's so many, and there's so much censorship, and there is so much propaganda that fuels these big juggernauts of mainstream media, corporatized network things that the masses consume. I say that in a effed up way, but the majority of people don't put in the legwork to actually look at multiple sources. Why should they? Why would they? Just go about your lives. But it's hard to really figure out what's actually going down, and without going crazy, is my opinion.
You mean in authoritarian states?
Anywhere, right? What do you think the Chinese are taught propaganda-wise? Look, that's a great point, actually. In China, the government controls your internet traffic. Short of having a VPN and going around things that have incredibly effed up repercussions if you get caught, how do you actually know the truth? Same could be applied to...
How effective is a VPN against the Chinese firewall?
Against it? No. Oh, it's 100%. You go and you're connecting to a remote source and routing your traffic through it. So if you had like insert $ whatever provider, like Nord or any of the other Surfshark, whatever, you're connecting to a server and you're tunneling your traffic. It's 100% effective.
VPN's possession of a VPN is a crime, though, isn't it?
VPN.
Yeah, they are. In China, they are. It's a crime.
No, that's incorrect. You have to actually define what the policies behind what you're using the VPN for. So
it is a crime under the Chinese Ministry of Industry and Information.
Peer-to-peer network.